Oh no, dude, are you serious? I have no idea.
Flowers that I haven't seen yet, but there weren't many out there. Lots of trillium.
Oh, yeah, trillium. Yep.
I'll be out next weekend though.
Yeah, it's just a little cold, you know. As soon as it starts to warm up a little bit, it'll be good.
Saw some devil's urn fungi, which I don't know fungi at all, but it's this like really like black, like cup-shaped fungus. Last week, it's like really cool looking.
So how did you key it out?
I had Seek on my phone. I just pointed it right at it and told me what it was.
Nice.
Seek, great. I use Lens. That's the one. Looks like Jennifer's sending us some messages. Okay.
Bloodroot, what does that look like?
Yeah, look it up. It's great.
Look it up.
I've been using iNaturalist. They're doing a bio blitz right now for New York State and the Great Lakes.
Really? Huh. I didn't know that.
That's what I use all the time is iNaturalist.
Mm-hmm.
I found a nice northern water snake yesterday.
Oh, those are cool. They're aggressive though. those are mean snakes. Not the nice garters.
I had to warn the person driving down the trail, the park police, that there was a snake and not to run it over.
Yeah. Probably trying to warm up in the sun.
I did chase him off the trail when I came back through because I was afraid somebody was going to hit it with a bicycle.
Yeah, yeah. When I worked at the college at Brockport, I would walk the canal because the Erie Canal was right on campus, and I would see the water snakes coming out to sun themselves, get a little warm up. Well, great. I think we might as well go ahead and start. It's 2 after 11 here. And I want to thank our presenters today, Matt Gallo and Megan Harris, for doing a phenomenal job on our citizen science programs. This year, they've really knocked it out of the park with recruitment and engagement. And so we're really fortunate to have both of them on staff right now. And so today's program, we're going to look at what the community science programs are in the Finger Lakes region. We're going to start out with Matt Gallo and his terrestrial work, and then we're going to go right into Megan Harris, who is doing the aquatic portion of our citizen science work. If you have any questions, please put it in the chat box. We may stop the presentation if there's a break to ask and answer questions, or we can save it to the end, depending on how the flow of the presentation is. So drop your messages there. We're happy to answer them. And we'll also be dropping our emails in there so that you can and follow up with additional questions if you have them. So take it away, Mr. Gallo.
All right, let's jump right into it. All righty there. Hey, everyone. How's it going? Glad you could all make it out here today and listen to us rant about invasive species. So just a little bit about us before we jump into things here. My name is Matt. I'm the Terrestrial Invasive Species Outreach Coordinator for the Finger Lakes PRISM. And Megan is the Aquatic Invasive Species Program Coordinator for the PRISM as well. PRISM is an acronym standing for Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. Oh, excuse me. Looks like I accidentally clicked there. Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. We are a collaboration between New York State and Hobart and Williamsburg colleges, where funding is provided with the New York State DEC's environmental protection funds. That is sent to us, and we work with Hobart and Williamsburg colleges to basically advance invasive species outreach, education, and management in the Finger Lakes area. So we cover a 17 county region. You can see in the little map down here, from Rochester in the west to Syracuse in the east to Binghamton down south. And this is a really great partnership because it's really good at leveraging sort of like the funding that New York State can provide and the technical expertise of a place like Hobart and Williamsburg colleges. We are not also the only PRISM in New York State. We have different sister organizations, and there are other regional PRISMs throughout the rest of the state. So there's one in Long Island, there's one in the Adirondacks, one in Western New York. These are really great ways to really tackle invasive species on a local level. And if you haven't heard of us before, you might have at least run into us at some point in the past, especially before COVID. We did a lot of different outreach and education events, and we have a lot of different outreach materials that are sort of out there in the Finger Lakes region. So if you've seen these field guides or these fact sheets, these clean, drain, dry billboards, or maybe these boot brush signs at trailheads, those are all from us. And the reason why we exist in the first place, and the reason why we come up with all this material, is because invasive species are really one of the biggest environmental problems that we have here in New York State. These three pictures, I think, really do a good job of showing the sort of damage that invasive species can cause. So here in the top left is a forest in Pennsylvania, and this forest has been pretty much entirely defoliated by gypsy moth. Gypsy moth is an invasive moth species originally from Europe, and they are defoliators, so the caterpillars will eat the leaves of the trees. And pretty much without any natural predators, gypsy moth populations have been allowed to grow pretty much exponentially in North America. And you can clearly see what sort of consequences that ends up having, right? So like all these brown areas, we're talking about like tens, maybe like hundreds of thousands of trees that have been completely defoliated in this area. And you can imagine that, like, if you're a tree living in this forest, your life is now suddenly a lot harder now that you have to deal with this invasive species on top of the other things that you have to deal with. This picture down here, this is a car. I guess they were towing out of a lake somewhere, but this car is covered in zebra mussels. This is much more up Megan's alley, as I'm more the terrestrial guy, but zebra mussels are one of the worst aquatic invasive species that we've seen, especially here in New York. They pretty much have invaded all of our water bodies. And what zebra mussel does is that because their populations have been able to get so high, they're filter feeders. So they will basically suck the nutrients right out of the water column. And there's so many of them that they have completely changed sort of like the nutrient balance in a lot of our aquatic ecosystems. And that has had really adverse impacts on the way that our food webs are set up in our water bodies here. And finally, this picture on the right is a picture of kudzu. So kudzu is a vine originally native to Japan. It's not found here in New York State. It's really more of a problem down south where it's a lot warmer. New York's a little too cold for them. But pretty much everything in this picture is just covered in kudzu in some way, right? So like all these trees are just covered in kudzu. And in all this like ground here is just completely just carpeted with this stuff. And you can imagine, right, if you are one of these trees or you are some animal or plant like living on the grounds, it is really, really hard to make a living in this area. So I think these three pictures really do a good job of showing sort of like the totality of the impacts an invasive species can have in a very like visceral sort of way. So what exactly like are invasive species in the first place, right? Like what is it about like these three species and other invasive species? What do they have in common that makes them different from other plant animal species? So invasive species, if we can define them, are basically a species that is not native to an ecosystem. So they are originally from one place and they were brought over to a new place. And their introduction causes or is likely to cause environmental, economic harm or harm to human health. And a lot of invasive species have the same traits that really make them successful. So first and foremost, they have very high reproductive rates. Whether it's a plant or an animal, we're talking about species here that can pump out hundreds, if not thousands, of eggs or seedlings. They're also very aggressive. These are species that can grow very quickly. As we saw with like kudzu before, this is a species that like it'll just grow everywhere, right? These are species that are not just going to stick to like one confined area. And what's really important too is that they have no natural predators, right? So there are no, or at least very few, native plants and animals that are really interacting with these species in a meaningful way, right? Like they don't have any natural checks and balances that are going to keep their populations under control in some sort of way. And the way we, especially with invasive plants, is that they have really low nutritional values. We sort of think of them as they're like the potato chips of like the natural worlds. So oftentimes, even if like something like a deer would eat an invasive species, they preferentially just wouldn't go after it because they're just not that nutritious for them. And what I think is really important is this idea that invasive species are really good at taking advantage of human disturbance. So we as humans are dramatically changing our environment, right? We're building roads, we're building houses, suburbs, cities. And these areas are sort of like the perfect places for invasive species to come in and then take over, right? So our native species are really well adapted to these sort of like intact, pristine ecosystems, and they don't really do well with all of this dramatic change. But invasive species are really well adapted to areas that are highly disturbed. So not only are there all of these other traits that make invasive species really well suited to it, but we're almost sort of like designing our environment to make invasive species really successful in a way. And so with that being said, you might be thinking, well, like, how did they even get here? Like, how does this happen in the first place? A lot of the times, invasive species might be introduced intentionally. This is very true when you think about things like the pet trade or like landscaping plants. Oftentimes, you know, most of the plants in people's front yards are going to be non-native species, and especially like the things you could buy at like Home Depot and stuff. But a lot of the times, invasive species can really just get here by accident. With the amount of international trade that we have nowadays between different countries on different continents, we've seen that invasive species are really good at hitching a ride on the cars, the boats, and the planes that are constantly crisscrossing across the world. And then once those vehicles land in a new place, so do the invasive species, and then they're able to sort of take over things from there. And the costs of invasive species are really, really immense. So from the economic angle, we're talking about huge impacts on agriculture, forestry, tourism. The environmental side of things, we're talking about impacts on biodiversity, impacts on natural processes, aesthetics, and even impacts on human health too. So we're talking about a decrease in water quality, increases in things like flooding, and especially if you're talking about something like giant hogweed, we're talking about an increase in like even disease and illnesses. And we can even put like numbers on that, those costs too, right? So invasive species have directly contributed to the extinction of hundreds of species worldwide and the decline of even thousands more. And in the US alone, we annually spend $120 billion every year just trying to control invasive species. So these are not small issues in any way, shape, or form. And so one of the problems that we as invasive species managers usually run into is that it might sound silly, but we literally just don't know where invasive species are half the time. The problem with invasive species is that they're often able to spread much faster than we are able to keep up with, right? And like going back to what we talked about like before, like we cover a 17 county area, right? There are thousands of miles of hiking trails. There are, dozens of water bodies. It's just, it's too large of an area for us to realistically keep tabs on. And there's a really good way that we could sort of like visualize how an invasive species can spread. And this is with what's called the invasive species curve. So this is sort of like a generalization of how an invasive species spreads over time, right? So when an invasive species is first introduced to an area, as you can see down here in the bottom left, their populations will often be quite small, right? And so the area infested, the area that they're actually taking up will be quite small, which means that the control costs, the actual amount of money that you have to spend to get rid of that invasive species is going to be quite low because you don't have to cover a wide area. The problem is that the longer that an invasive species goes undetected, the harder and harder it becomes to control them because they are going to be spreading to a wider and wider area. So, right, so once they reach a certain point where their population gets larger, the costs become too great to actually eradicate them. So we have to mainly focus on containing those species. But often we usually don't end up finding invasive species in the first place until the costs of removing them and the area that they infest is just too large for it to be like realistic in any meaningful way, right? So what we're trying to do with both the trail survey program that I'm running this year and the Macrophyte survey that Megan's going to be running is that we are trying to increase the scope of people looking for invasive species so that when we do find them, we're not finding them here where they're out of control, but we're going to be finding them here where we could still eradicate them or maybe even contain them. So going into the trail survey, which is what I'm going to be working on, basically we have a program, volunteer program, where we are asking volunteers to identify, survey, and report invasive species that they see on trails in the Finger Lakes region. And this is a really simple, really easy to get into program. Pretty much anyone can participate, anyone who has any sort of smartphone or smart device. You don't have to be qualified in any sort of way. You don't have to have any experience with invasive species identification or anything like that. We're really looking for anyone who just likes to be outside. When it comes to being outside, we really don't have any preferences either as to where you would even survey for invasive species. It can be pretty much any trail near you, right? So if you're the kind of person who just like takes strolls in their local parks, that's completely fine. If you're the kind of person who wants to do the whole Finger Lakes Trail and survey all 500 miles of it, that is, fine by us as well. Go get them. So the way that the trail survey works is that we ask volunteers to survey the same trail 3 times throughout the summer. So once in June, once in July, and then once finally in August for common invasive species. And doing this over the course of the summer is a really good way to sort of see the different invasive species as they appear throughout the year, right? So like a lot of times when you're looking for invasive plants, some of them are flowering right now, some of them are going to be flowering at the end of August. So doing this over the course of the summer is a really good way of being able to see the different invasive species when they're most prominent. And so why are we surveying trails? So like we talked about before, right? Like invasive species are really good at invading all different kinds of ecosystems, like along roadsides, for instance. So why specifically are we looking for trails? Well, the thing is that trails are often areas that are pretty disturbed as well. These are areas that have a lot of human foot traffic. We often clear the edges of trails, right, to make sure that they're passable. So these are areas that invasive species really like to invade, often just as much as they're going to invade a roadside or a suburban neighborhood. And there's actually specific conditions on the edges of these trails that really make them really well suited for an invasion by an invasive species. So this is something what's called like the edge effect. So basically there are different environmental conditions at the edge of a forest than there are in the interior of the forest. Usually this is attributed to more sunlight, and with more sunlight, you're going to get a warmer temperature, lower moisture. And that really is really helpful for invasive species, and it really allows them to invade an area quite quickly. And these are conditions that our native species, which are more adapted to living in sort of the deep forest interior where it's much, you have much higher moisture, you have lower temperatures. These are conditions that they are not particularly well suited to live in. So these are areas where we're often going to find a lot of invasive species. And this picture really sort of hammers that point home, right? So this is a trail that has been taken over by Japanese knotweed. There actually is a trail here. You can sort of see if you make it out the bottom, a little brown patch. That's where the trail is supposed to be. But pretty much all on the sides here, this is all Japanese knotweed. This is an invasive species that has moved into this area. The conditions on the edges of the trails are just right for the species to do well. And so they've been able to grow quite impressively here. So when it comes to the trail survey, we have three different processes that we go through, three basic steps. You identify species, you survey for those species, and you report those species. So when it comes to identifying species, like I was saying before, you do not have to be an expert in any way to take part in this program. That also applies to knowing how to identify invasive species. We will teach you how to identify the most common and most high priority invasive species in our area, right? So we're talking about things like Japanese knotweed or mile-a-minute or spotted lanternfly here. We just had our first training on how to identify invasive species last week. We had a great turnout, about 50 people showed up. If you think that you would like to take part in our program, we would be more than happy to help you learn how to identify invasive species. We have saved that original training and we have posted it to our YouTube channel. So if you are interested, you can go to the link that we're going to send at the end of this and check out how to identify all the different invasive species. And so generally when we're talking and teaching people how to identify invasive species, for the most part, we're talking about invasive plants. This is mostly because these are the main species group of organisms that are of concern here in New York. We do have other invasive like groups of organisms too. We have invasive mammals, we have invasive birds, but for the most part, we're seeing the most negative impacts from our invasive plants. And the impacts from those invasive plants are usually quite similar. So we're talking about, these are species that are all able to grow very aggressively. And when what comes with that aggressive growth comes the ability to crowd out native species, right? So they form these really dense thickets that make it pretty much impossible for native species to be able to grow in those sorts of environments. And often, as we talked about before, they have very low nutritional value, so deer aren't really going to eat these things. They're going to go after the native species instead. And this picture really just gets into just what I was talking about. This is Japanese knotweed again. And you can imagine, right, if you are a native plant and you're trying to make a living in this thicket, there's pretty much no way you're going to be able to get the sunlight, the nutrients, or the water you need if your seed is sprouting in a thicket like this, right? So this is really a no-win situation for our native plants and animals. So once you learn how to identify the different species, you actually have to go out and survey for them. This process is super simple. Basically, you start at the beginning of a trail or a desired point that you deem as necessary. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to imagine an imaginary circle with a radius of 50 feet around you. And all you're going to do is you're going to just stop where you are and you're just going to look around within that circle and just identify all the species that you can, right? So you're going to stop, you're going to be like, okay, I see some garlic mustard over there. I see some honeysuckle over there. Then using the IMAP invasive species reporting tool, this is an app that you can download on your phone. You're going to report the size of that infestation and the distribution of the species that you're seeing, right? So whether you're seeing just a few scattered plants here and there, or you're just going to see a field of an invasive species. We want to know how big the infestation is. And once you record those invasive species on your phone, you simply just move on to the next 50-foot location and you just keep doing this as you work your way down the trail. And then this is just a visualization of how that circle works, right? So you're going to stand like right here, and then you're going to look out and just see the invasive species that you can find, right? And so we're not asking you to actually like go out into the brush to look for these invasive species. All we're asking is that you just report the invasive species that you could actually see with your eyes. You don't have to go off into the woods or anything. And when it comes down to reporting, there's a really great tool that we have for that. So we have the IMAP Invasive Species app. Basically, this is an app that is used nationwide, but here in New York, we have our sort of our local version where it is a database where all of the reports from anyone who uses the app is sort of collected. And then we as invasive species managers can actually see all of the points that you guys take. And that is super helpful for us for actually, getting an idea of like where the biggest problems are and how we're actually going to go about dealing with those. We actually have our first training on how to report invasive species with the IMAP Invasive Species app tonight for the trail survey. It's at 6 o'clock. If you're interested, we could send along a link to that meeting. If you can make it tonight. If you can't make it tonight, we are going to be recording this presentation as well and be putting it on our YouTube channel. So you can still participate even if you're not able to make it to the meetings in person. And of course, for anyone who's taking part in this this survey, it's really important to be safe out there, especially in regards to things like poison ivy and particularly ticks. Always make sure that you're checking for ticks and don't go in near any plants that you think might be poison ivy. We don't want anyone to get hurt or sick in any way because of this program. And so there's actually really good evidence that volunteers have been finding invasive species much quicker than we otherwise would in the past. So for instance, like spotted lanternfly, the sky right down here in the bottom left, this is an invasive species that is rapidly spreading across the East Coast. And we currently have 3 populations in New York State that were just detected within the last year. 2 of those populations were found by just normal volunteers, right? So this has been proven in the past to be really successful, and it really helps us get out ahead in terms of the newest invasive species that are coming to our areas. And with all of that being said, invasive species and all the problems that they cause, this is often a field that when we talk about invasive species, it can be a little bit depressing, right? We have straight up just lost the battle to a lot of different invasive species in the past. And there are a lot of invasive species that have become so successful that we really start thinking of them as native species. This is really a big problem. It's had a really big impact on our economy and our ecology. But if you're someone who is looking to be a part of the solution, we would love to have you come join us for the trail survey. It's not too late to get started. We put our past trainings up on YouTube. We have a group on Facebook where people can post different questions about invasive species that they're finding, and they can take part in the trail survey community. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at gallo@hws.edu. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have about the trail survey. If you're interested in getting started, I could help you get started along that path as well. So that's my spiel. Thank you guys for listening, and I will pass things over to Megan.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. And again, if you want to put your email address into the chat box and link to the YouTube channel, I'm sure that people who want more information, you could reach right out to Matt directly. And now we'll talk about our aquatic macrophyte survey.
All right, let me pull that up real quick. All right, so as has been stated a couple times already, my name is Megan Harris. I am the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator, the aquatic counterpart to Matt, basically. This year, I will be running the Macrophyte survey program, and it's a similar idea to what Matt had, to what Matt's trail survey is involving the community in getting them engaged in invasive species and helping prevent the spread and recognizing them with our resources. So how does it work? All the participants need to get involved is access to a body of water, literally any body of water that you can access legally. You can take a sample, and It doesn't have to be one of our main Finger Lakes. It can be anything: river, stream, lake, pond, any body of water. We're like has been pointed out, we span across 17 counties, and with our resources, we really can't. It would take a lot of resources to be able to reach every water body throughout our 17 counties. So anywhere that a invasive species is growing, it has the potential to spread somewhere else. So any sample that you take is useful. You also need a smartphone or tablet, just like the trail survey, so that you can report what you're finding, but we provide the rest. This is an example of a kit up in the right-hand corner that we've provided in the past. Lots of identification guides. When people are just starting out plant identification, it helps have a lot of resources and different examples of the plants that they might find. Even me, who has experience with plant identification, when I first started, I was a watercraft steward last year, and when I first started, the first thing I found was curly-leaf pondweed, which if you've ever seen it before, it's super recognizable, but even I was just so unexposed to it. I even had a hard time figuring out what it was with my ID guide. So we definitely make the effort to help you out and give you as much as we possibly can. The rake up top is our main tool for the program. It's way more simple than you would think to sample for aquatic invasive species. You don't need like high-tech gadgets to see what's underwater. There are no underwater rovers that we have for this program. Just this rake with a rope tied to it. This one specifically is a rake, 2 rakes zip tied together with the handles cut off and a rope tied to it. So you drop the rake into the water, let it reach the bottom, pull it up and see what you find. It's actually really good at grabbing plants, way more than you would expect to pull out, as long as the plants are there. And then we provide a bin so that you can put some water in it and move the plants around. Aquatic plants get really droopy and stick together when they're out of the water. So this allows you to take good pictures for identification so that you can send them to us and we can confirm your findings. We also provide training for our volunteers. This is obviously before COVID-19. Now, one person is wearing a mask, but last year and this year we had to adjust and have been doing virtual trainings, but the content remains the same. We go over the threats that invasive species pose to our resources. We talk about how to do a rake toss, which I just told you. You just drop the rake to the bottom and pull it up and let us know what you found. We go over Macrophyte ID, what parts of the plants to look for and take pictures of, leaf size, leaf margins, flower types. And then we go into the reporting tool, which for us is going to be IMAP Invasive, like the trail survey. So after the training, we just ask you to take a sample of this spot once every 2 weeks throughout the summer and keep a special eye out for our top 3 invasive species. These are them: hydrilla water chestnut and starry stonewort. All of these species have the same characteristics that invasive species have that Matt was talking about previously. They grow quickly, they take over resources and outcompete natives, but they aren't really at the top of that invasion curve yet, so we still have time to make and take impactful action to try to prevent the spread and control these species. So they're our top priority, but of course we ask that you report anything that you find. We send out bi-weekly newsletters so that we can let you know what kind of stuff you are likely to find, so that you're not looking for hydrilla in June, which usually doesn't come out until later in the summer. And we just ask that you report your findings to IMAP Invasives. This image on the right-hand side is a screenshot of part of the data entry for IMAP. So you enter the species that you found. For our program, it's pretty much always species detected, because you can't really confidently go out and say for sure that a certain species is not there unless you've surveyed every single point within a certain area. So species detected, and then we ask that you take as many photos as you can, more than you think you need, so that we can make sure that we can confirm what you're finding. Unfortunately, if you don't take pictures and send them to us, we have no way to confirm them, and it is essentially the same as you never having submitted that record. So photos are extremely important for this program. Over time, the MSP has expanded. Last year, there was a dip in numbers due to COVID, and we were operating for 1 month less because while we figured out how to operate the program safely during COVID-19, but we were still able to get it up and running, and we did have our watercraft stewards involved this year, which if you are not familiar with the watercraft steward program, we have people stationed at boat launches throughout the region checking boats to make sure that aquatic invasive species are not hitching a ride from one water body to the next. So that's really useful because boat launches are a really likely spot for invasive species to first establish themselves, since they might be hitching a ride on boats and then falling off when they get into the water. We also have depended a lot on our lake associations and soil water conservation districts from different counties. These are people who have a stake already in the lakes. They're concerned, they want us to know so that we can help if something is found. And they've been really great in having us, specifically like Cortland County, Shenango County, we've been communicating with to be able to reach those farther away counties. Since the start of the program, we have done almost 1,000 rake tosses, and each one of these contributes to the understanding of our Finger Lakes and many other water bodies in this region. So community engagement is one of the biggest benefits of our program. As a PRISM in general, we focus on outreach and getting as much information out to the public as we can. The more people that know about invasive species, the more they can do to stop them and tell their friends, and then their friends can try to stop them. And so that's what we're doing. People who aren't part of the scientific community specifically are a huge win, who we are exposing to the first time. And it's really honestly just satisfying for me as a coordinator to see how excited people get when they're learning about stuff that I've chosen to make my career on. It helps with the spread of AIS information to others outside of the program. There was a survey done last year, and almost half of the people said they were doing their rake tosses with a friend or a loved one or a spouse, and that is huge. That extends our reach even further than we thought. And it creates lasting connections with the community so that people recognize our name, they see us in a good light, they come to us for information, they know where to come for information on this type of thing, and they can regularly stay involved with the fight against invasive species. Of course, like I said, this program expands our reach. We have been able to reach out, you can see in the map here, oops, sorry. Dots in Cortland County, down here in Schuyler County, I'm sorry. Cayuta Lake down here, spots that we aren't able to get to all the time. And people they are our eyes on the ground to know what's going on in these water bodies. It fills gaps in our monitoring efforts where we aren't able to reach, and allows for early detection and rapid response before these plants get way out of control. So if someone at the end of Canandaigua Lake found a new population of hydrilla, we would be able to hop right on that, add it to our list of spots, and start monitoring to see how far it really has gotten. And right here are just examples of some submissions from volunteers in the past. So this is Megan Swing, was one of our stewards last year, reported some starry stonewort in Canandaigua Lake. It was a population that we already knew, but interesting to see it, especially for her. Like, I had found starry stonewort at one time to actually see what it looks like in person, and then water chestnut and European frogbit found in Sodus Bay. And of course, we collect data. So I've got a few things that you can find from the data that we've collected. So we don't just focus on invasive species, we ask people to report as many species as they find. And I was able to create this map from our 2020 data to a kind of overall summary of native in green and blue is invasive species in each lake. So you have to keep in mind that we had different numbers of volunteers, different numbers of rake tosses done on each lake. But Canisius Lake, as you can see in this map over here, all the way on the left-hand side, we had a pretty good coverage on Canisius Lake. So I would say that that's a pretty solid representation of native versus invasive species. And this information is just pretty interesting to look at and check out. And also, it's pretty good to see all the native species that are being found. So you know that they're not, the invasive species haven't won the battle everywhere. Also, we ask for information on density of plants coming up on people's rakes. So ranging from none to dense, trace would be 1 handful, sparse is 2 handfuls, and medium is an armful. So I would describe this top left picture as sparse amount of plants, down at the bottom medium, and then over here on the right is our very own David Carr, who runs the Starry Stonewort Collaborative, with a very dense mat of starry stonewort on his rake. And this kind of information, with this kind of information, you can infer stuff about the ecosystem. So if you're scraping your rake across 3 feet of the lake floor and you're getting sparse or trace amounts of plants, you might be in a transition zone from deep to shallow water, or there might be other conditions that are not allowing plants to grow in the same capacity as in this dense area. Or you know that in these less dense areas, fish probably aren't reproducing there, using that as a habitat to have or to lay their eggs. Just information that you can infer from the amount of plants in a water body. And then also we look at phenology. So we ask people to sample in the same exact spot so that we can get an idea of when plants are coming in, when they're dying off. One example is curly leaf pondweed. We were able to see from the 2020 data. So we pretty much already know that curly leaf pondweed is an early sprouter and dies off before the end of the summer. But this is pretty solid data that we had last year showing that each consecutive month, between July, August, and September, the reports were actually cut in half each time. This year it'll be really interesting because right now we have a lot of volunteers signed up in Tompkins County at the southern end of Cayuga Lake, where we've had hydrilla populations. So maybe if people are finding hydrilla, which obviously, of course, we don't want them to, but if they do, maybe we'll be able to see exactly when it starts sprouting or coming in on our samples, which would be really interesting. For 2021, we are hoping to continue expanding our reach. Right now, we have at least 100 volunteers signed up throughout the Finger Lakes between past volunteers and new volunteers. We really want to reach those who don't already have a stake in the lake and who can really get into those untapped audiences, people who aren't as into the scientific community. But of course, those who are extremely helpful too. And we're actually going to focus a little more on like Facebook groups, or there's a program called Slack for communication between volunteers so that we can help each other in surveying and identifying. Also, we have changes to make based on our experience, but one thing that's helped a lot is the Rochester Institute of Technology. Some students over there did a capstone project on volunteer programs and volunteer recruitment and retainment. So some things that they told us is that our volunteers, a lot of the motivation comes from wanting a connection with the environment or feeling of community, that they're contributing to the community and they're helping their resources. So we want to focus and build a better sense of community between our volunteers, make sure that we're responding as soon as we can when they come to us with questions. We know it's really discouraging for them when they are putting this effort in trying to identify plants and they might feel clueless on their first couple of tries, so it would be really discouraging to go out there and make that effort and then not get feedback about it. And we want to celebrate their success. We want to make sure that they see the impact that they're making, show them the maps of the coverage we have across the region, tell them what people are finding, just really let them know that what they're doing is important. And so in conclusion, the program, our main goal, well, one of our main goals is to foster the connection between nature in their own backyard. And people will be sampling in places that they might have been around for years. And maybe they'll be able to answer the question of, what is this new plant sprouting by my dock? Is it invasive? Is it a threat? And really learn about the natural resources and the environment around them that they connect with on a daily basis. And I think it's great that we are showing people uncharted territory. Aquatic invasive species are hard because you don't go out on a boat and see them. But when you throw a rake toss, you might come up with 4 different plants that you thought you only saw one, because you could see that Eurasian water milfoil flower right there on the top, but you can't see the cara or the curly-leaf pondweed or the elodia, which are a mixture of native and invasive plants. And overall, this program contributes to the goals of the Finger Lakes PRISM. The 2 main things that we focus on are outreach and invasive species control. And with this program, we are able to do both of them. So hopefully people continue to gain positive experiences from it and are able to share their information far and wide with those that they interact with. So we're looking forward to another great year. If you have any other questions about the program, let me know. Right now, we are pretty high in numbers, considering the number of rakes we have, but we are hoping to do some trainings halfway through the summer as well. Right now, we have one scheduled for June 5th, and we're hoping to do one in July and August for anyone who wants to join part of the way through the summer. So yeah, I'll also put my email address in the chat box if anyone has any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Megan and Matt. These are great presentations, a great overview of what we're doing here in the Finger Lakes to try to create this volunteer engagement and really hammer home the idea that there's just too much land and water that we just can't, even though we want to survey and sample and be outside every day, it's just not possible to cover everything. So at this point, if anyone has any questions, I guess we can feel free to unmute yourself and ask directly, or just put it in the chat box. That would be appropriate as well. So you're planning to do June 5th, and that'll be a remote training?
Yep.
Okay. And then how are people getting their gear? Because there's gear involved with aquatics, but not necessarily with a terrestrial survey.
Yeah, we'll be mailing out the gear. So when you sign up, make sure to send me your address so that we can mail it out as soon as it's ready. We'll be doing lots of packing in the next few weeks to make sure we've got everything ready for our volunteers.
Great. And if they already have a rake, you're just providing additional resources or field guides if they need them. They might have their stuff from last year.
Exactly. Yep.
And there's about 20% of recurring people.
Yep, I would say that's about right.
Or maybe 50. If there were 31 people last year and 22 people are, so it's actually 2/3.
More than half. Yeah, sorry, I was thinking 20% of the.
Yeah, I know, me too. Yeah, so that's a great retention rate. Is 66% of the people who did it last year are now wanting to do it this year. So that really provides validity that the program is of value. Deb Nero asked if Matt has any field guides for terrestrial invasive plants.
Yeah, so we have the specifically like our Finger Lakes like field guides and fact sheets. You can actually find those on our website. If I give me a second, I could look it up and send it over to you. They're really great for giving you a good sense of what we can find in our area.
And Deb, if you want to email Matt, he can certainly mail you out some.
Yep, I'll
And-
email him. I'll email him because I've got another question to ask him about giving a presentation too.
Okay, sounds good.
So I will be emailing.
Sounds great.
So, question from Nancy: how do we get an assigned trail after we do the training? There are no assigned trails. That's the beauty of the trail survey. It's literally whatever trail you want to hike on. If it's something near you, or it's just in an area that you've always wanted to hike to, it's totally up to you where and when you want to hike.
But certainly, Nancy, we can provide some information and guide you if you're, looking for that feedback. We can get on, a really good thing is that we could almost, Zoom call with you or just talk to you or email you. What would be the best is to understand where you're located. And then what we can do is we can pull up the IMAP Invasives Plant Survey, and we can get a sense of, oh gosh, these areas are really undersurveyed. That would be really helpful if you did this area. So I'm not sure what county you're located, but say you're in Onondaga County, Green Lake, they've got a ton of parks out there. And we know that like Green Lakes is highly mapped, maybe on this trail, but the Canal Way might have some invasive species. So we certainly work with you to try to guide you as to the best strategic sampling, but then we don't want to make it too onerous by telling you which trail to do, because that would be restrictive as well.
All right, so which one of you do I contact about that?
You contact me if you're interested in stuff about the trail survey. And I left my email in the chat too, so gallo@hws.edu. Shoot me an email whenever you get the chance, and I'll be happy to help you. And it looks like we got another question from Michelle. If I'm doing the same trail as last year, do I want to do all the same species I found last year? Yeah, so we're pretty much asking you guys to look for the same species that we told you to look for last year, with just a couple of changes. But for the most part, we're asking you to look for the same species, but really just, look for the species that the landscape is giving you, right? So maybe this year you won't find, let's say you were finding a lot of garlic mustard last year and you're not finding any this year. Don't just look for garlic mustard if, let's say Japanese knotweed moved into where garlic mustard was. So be really mindful that the landscape can often change, and that if you are hiking the same trail, you might be seeing new invasive species where there were old invasive species. So keep the same list that you had last year in mind, but recognize that there are going to be some changes from year to year, and that's just sort of how things are just going to happen out in the landscape.
Okay, so I found a lot of honeysuckle, like a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Do it again this year to say it's still in this spot.
Yeah, it is important for us to know. So I think I understand what you're asking now. Like if you're just taking the same point of like the same species like year after year. It is still important that we know where invasive species are, if they are persisting in an area from year to year, right? Because you might find like the honeysuckle you found last year, and you might find this year that it's like doubled in size, right? So it's really important for us to have an understanding of where invasive species are like really persisting and dominating a landscape. So if you are taking sort of like the same points, it is still valuable to us to know, even if it looks exactly like all the points you took last year.
Okay.
That's the case, Michelle. If you need to make it a bigger scope for yourself, so instead of mapping every 50 feet, you find yourself just overlapping those. If you wanted to do 100 feet, that's certainly a possibility too, because the landscape may not have changed too much if you're finding yourself mapping the same thing. But then maybe you could key out, a harder species to look for.
Yeah, I think last year because it was like hundreds of feet of honeysuckle and Phragmites, that trail had a lot of those.
Yeah. So what you could do in that case is get your start point for honeysuckle or frag, and then, map the end point. And then
yeah, that's how I did it. So I'll just do that way again.
Yeah, that's a good plan, because you'll be stopping and mapping so many different things. Well, great. It doesn't look like anyone else has any other questions unless you want to unmute and just, throw some out there. We really thank you for your participation in both of these programs, and for Megan and Matt for leading these and facilitating the work here. Obviously, just as Deb had indicated, if you're looking for a person to do presentations, Matt and Megan, aquatic or terrestrial, certainly you can reach out to them to set something up for your Lake Association trail conference, whatever you're working with, whatever affiliation you have. Certainly we would love to provide information. The more that we can get out into the community with this messaging, the better off it is. So, don't feel shy to reach out to us. Well, thank you, everybody. I guess we'll close a little bit early and enjoy your day. And we look forward to seeing you on the trails and in the water.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.